Today's episode of the No Fun City podcast is brought to you by Questrade. There's a new world of investing where the fees are low and you come first. It's time to switch. Head over to questrade.com to check out do-it-yourself, self-directed investing. Take matters into your own hands, build your own investment portfolio with a self-directed account, and save on fees. Make your money work harder. Questrade is Canada's fastest growing online brokerage with over 21 years experience in the Canadian market, $18 billion in assets under administration, and a 9-time winner of the best managed companies in Canada. And you could rest assured knowing that your money is in good hands. They go above and beyond to protect your account with an additional $10 million in private insurance, so you know your money is safe. For more information, check out questrade.com. Just use the link in the description below. On to our show. Welcome to the No Fun City podcast, episode 22. Got a lot going on. First of all, I just want to say this episode was filmed. This is the third time I'm filming this episode. All right. So for those of you who don't know, and if you watch the podcast regularly and you see that there is no guest, it is because I am today's guest, probably for one time only. I broke this down in the last episode, and I'm sorry about the delay in this episode. There's just a lot of things that happened. Number one, I got an eye infection. It's still there. It's just like a rash that won't go away, and my eye was super puffy. And I debated doing the podcast episode with sunglasses on, but then I didn't want to be that guy wearing sunglasses inside. And for those of you who listen to the podcast on Spotify or Apple or, I don't know, Amazon Music or whatever, you can catch the podcast video on YouTube if you didn't know that. So that's why that kind of matters. That being said, as discussed in episode 21, I mentioned that I had received over the past year and a half, I would say, a lot of messages and emails about podcasting and how to start a podcast and what do you need and why did you start yours? So I took all those questions, kind of like briefed them up and summed them up into a bunch of notes. And today we're going to discuss my podcasting experience so far. We're only 22 episodes in, but it seems like I've gotten a little bit of traction at least. And I have learned a lot in these 22 episodes. So we're going to start a little bit with my background, because a lot of people don't really know, I guess, who I am or why I even started the podcast or where this all came from. So in 2017, I believe, I started a YouTube channel just for fun. I didn't do it for any other reason. I just wanted to sort of get better at my filming and editing skills, because it's part of what I do for a living now. And essentially start this YouTube channel, my personal YouTube channel. You could still catch it. It's on YouTube, obviously. And what happens is essentially I start getting a little bit of traction there, to the point where I ended up getting a sponsor that was quite a big name, in my opinion, in longboarding, in the longboarding sector or industry. And from there, I ended up gaining even more sponsors for that channel. And as I was doing all that, my personal YouTube channel is just like a clutter. It's a bunch of stuff, from product reviews to electric longboard videos to, trips I took, things like that. Things of that nature, I guess you could say. And from that point, I decided, okay, I'm going to do a podcast. I decided to call it No Fun City because I own a domain called nofuncity.ca. I wasn't really going to relate the podcast to Vancouver, which is the city that I live in, for those of you who aren't from here. But somehow that happened. Somehow, I guess because all my guests were from Vancouver or Canadian, and the fact that it was called No Fun City, it just became like this Vancouver-based podcast, which I'm kind of happy that is the case, because I kind of found my niche, which we're going to discuss down the road later in this podcast. But that's essentially the background of how the podcast got started. I do everything myself. So I, get my guests, set up everything, the cameras, all that jazz. And then I also edit in post and also post the podcast to all the, different platforms where you can catch it. So in starting this podcast, I started with the branding and that kind of, the marketing aspect, the graphics, I guess you could say. And a lot of people kind of don't know where to start when they start a podcast. And I think that's why, first of all, I got so many emails, but also second of all, why it's important to kind of think about why you want to do the podcast to begin with. It's a huge aspect of whether you should do it or not, because a lot of people think podcasting is fun, and it is. I think it's fun. I get to talk to interesting people and get to see what they're up to. And I got to meet a bunch of people that I would otherwise not have met or known. So for me, it's really interesting in that sense. For you, you might just think it's going to be something fun for you to do, but understand that it's also work. Like it legitimately is work. So, I started posting these podcast episodes just on my YouTube channel. And at this point, I wasn't really thinking about the podcast long term. It was just something, once again, I was doing for fun. I wasn't doing it for any other reason other than fun. And I wish, looking back on it, I wish I had started a separate channel, like a separate YouTube channel for the podcast right off the bat. And I'm going to explain why that is. But first, I just want to get everybody to grasp a sense of where I'm coming from with the podcast and how it got started and why I did it. I think it's important to understand that factor first. So as I started the podcast through my YouTube channel, I was getting, I'm not getting thousands of views on YouTube. I'm probably getting anywhere between 100 to 400 views. So nothing to brag about. But what it did do, it allowed me to add another avenue of content, and it allowed me to promote my sponsors through another avenue as well. So on top of my other videos, now there's this podcast that can also generate some sort of hype for the sponsors of the channel. So all that being said, that's how I got started into the podcast. So, and obviously that's why it's called No Fun City. It's just because I happen to own the domain, haven't done anything with it yet, but all those things are coming up. You will see a No Fun City podcast website get posted and things like that are brewing now. And they've been brewing for a while, but it's just, since it's just me doing it, it's just a lot of work to do on your own. So quickly, I'm going to break down everything we're going to discuss throughout this podcast. And you can feel free to skip some portions. Just, there's certain things that just relate to you or that you want to know specifically. You can skip to those portions. Maybe on the YouTube channel, I'll do timestamps so you could see where everything gets discussed. But we're going to go over things like the tech aspect. So essentially my setup, what I use, what you can use for a podcast, what I recommend you do. Everything from cameras to mics, stuff like that. We're going to talk about guests, like how to get guests, how I got my guests, how all that sort of happened and how I go about doing that. We're going to talk about everything that can go wrong, will go wrong, because it does. Literally every episode, something goes wrong, no matter what I do. And I'm going to break down all the instances where I've had an issue with the podcast, which includes this episode, because as I mentioned, in this episode, this is the third time I'm filming it. The third time. So imagine that. But another thing on top of all that, I gotta say, I'm happy I did the 21 episodes before doing this one, because there is no way I would be able to talk by myself in a room for however long this is going to go for, probably an hour. So all that being said, my dog always does this. This little guy, he always wants some love when I'm doing the podcast. And I apologize if you listen to a few of the older episodes. You'll probably hear some panting or snoring in the background every once in a while. That is my dog, Lucas. And for some reason, I can't figure out a way to either get him to stop or leave me alone. he never wants my attention until I'm doing something. And as you can see on the video, he is hopping on my chair, begging for my attention right now, which you will not receive, my friend. I'm sorry. Eventually he'll go sit down, but it usually takes about 3 to 5 minutes for him to realize that I'm busy. Oh, poor guy. That being said, so the first thing that went wrong with this episode, I'm going to break this down real quick for you, is I filmed it, but I forgot a bunch of stuff that I was supposed to talk about. I don't know why. I guess I didn't prepare properly for this one. It was a different episode, you know, when you're kind of the interviewer, but you're also the person getting interviewed, in a sense. You know, you kind of miss some things from time to time. Because I'm no longer the person just asking the questions. I'm also answering them, and then I kind of skip over some things. So the first episode, I was just like, oh man, I got to redo this. So then I redid it. And the second time I did it, it was awesome. And I go to post, you know, I'm going to go edit this video. And sure enough, what happens is as the files are uploading, I accidentally delete them at the same time. And I didn't realize I was deleting other files, and I just happened to be deleting the same files that were uploading as they were uploading. So they didn't upload, and I lost all the video footage other than one camera. And I don't like doing one camera. I got 3 cameras on me right now. We'll discuss that tech in a bit. But yeah, so then I had to film it again, which is all fine. I'm here. I'm going to do it. But that's why there is a huge delay between last episode and this episode. And I really apologize. I try to do these episodes once a month, but sometimes like pandemic hit, you know, we went 3 months without an episode. All these things happen. So, you know, the eye infection. So I couldn't do an episode at all. I had to wait for this to kind of clear up. I didn't want to have like a messed up eye, you know, while I'm filming and stuff. But you're going to get episode 22. And episode 23 is essentially going to follow this probably 1 week later, just so we can get caught up. And that's going to be the last episode of the year. And then we're going to go back to a whole new season. Well, I guess not a whole new season, but episode 24 will be posted in the new year, which I'm really looking forward to because we got some really cool, interesting guests. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But real quick, I'm going to get the tech stuff out of the way because this, in my opinion, is the more dull stuff to talk about. And it's pretty straightforward. The first thing you got to think about when it comes to the tech is what's your end goal here? Do you just want to do audio? Do you want to do audio and video? Like, do you want to do both? You know, how many people are on this podcast? Are you doing it over Zoom? Are you doing it, you know, face to face? Both? Like, what? You got to arrange that aspect before you can really sit down and determine how many cameras you're going to use, or if you're going to have lighting kit or not. All these things. In my opinion, I suggest you heavily invest in a decent mic. And by decent mic, I mean something that's probably roughly, I don't know, like $150, $200. Something that's at least somewhat prosumer or professional. Right off the bat, because the most important thing is the audio. You don't have to do video right away. There are lots of podcasts that start and they just do audio, and you could plow out so many episodes if you just stick to audio, because you don't have to edit video at all. Now, it'd be great if you do video too, especially if you have a production company behind you. I don't, hence why the episodes are once a month. But when it comes to video, I feel like if you really want to get ahead, start with your audio, especially because what I notice is there's a lot of people who start a podcast. They get like 5 or 6 episodes in, and then for whatever reason, maybe because they feel like they don't have enough listeners or they don't have enough viewers, or maybe they just give up because of that, you know, they stop doing it. So it would be a waste of your time if that's going to happen. At least you could get 10 episodes done. And you could do like back-to-back episodes in one day, like, you know, record them all in one day, 3 at a time, and then start posting them later in the weeks as they, you know, every week passes. So for me, I did it the completely opposite way. I started with video. I didn't have audio at all. it wasn't until I saw like the podcast got a little bit of traction and people were like, oh, your podcast is awesome. Oh, I really like it. And I got a lot more positive feedback than I got negative. And that was a plus, you know. But first and foremost, when it comes to tech, go with audio. Like if you had budget and you only have enough to whether it's get a camera or a mic or, you know, you're picking between those kinds of things, I would highly suggest you just go for the mic, save up for your camera later. I, for example, used 2 Sony A7S's. So they're DSLRs. They're really good cameras. And in the process of filming, and this is going of what could go wrong will go wrong. In the process of filming episode 19, while I was filming, my camera literally, like, not exploded, but like a puff of smoke came out of my camera. And now that camera is essentially a paperweight. It's actually sitting behind me somewhere on the counter. You guys might be able to see it. So really, you should focus on the audio aspect first. Now, what I don't recommend, from experience, if you get a Yeti Blue or Blue Yeti, yeah, these are actually decent mics, but I don't recommend you get the arm, because I now have to hold the arm up because it keeps coming down. So the arm of this was actually a POS, and I wish I just got the tabletop one because it was cheaper, and I don't have to hold it up. And it's more convenient. You could just put it anywhere on the table. The arm, it's awesome, or it was awesome, but it's more of a pain in the butt now. And I have to buy a new arm for the podcast. So there's that aspect. But you could even use a Tascam. You could use one of those, I think they're actually called Zooms, right? They're like a type of Tascam mic, like tabletop. You can use all those things. And the beautiful part of those ones is you could actually take it to go. So if you're one of those people that you go to your guest, you can just take it, pop it on a table. Both of you will have clear audio, and you're good to go. Now on my end, as I said, my camera is a paperweight now. It's fine. Hopefully I could get it repaired. But, you know, that's essentially like $1,000, I don't know, $2,000 or $1,500 camera or something like that. So hopefully it's not a waste, and hopefully I'm able to get that back. But beyond that, I use a webcam, which is this one right here. Pretty straightforward. I mean, you can get a webcam for like a decent one for like $100, I think. Maybe you can get it on sale for cheaper. I use my GoPro, which is the wide cam over there. And I use my iPhone 11 Pro Max. And I actually got the Pro Max because of the camera features. And I wanted something that I would be able to also add to my YouTube videos and stuff like that. So really, you don't need like super professional stuff. You can get like a GoPro Hero 7, 8, 9, 6, whatever. Most people have GoPros, right? And they're fairly cheap, and you could use them. Like, they're pretty, you know, like you could use them for a variety of things, you know, adventures, outdoor stuff, whatever. And they're pretty heavy duty. Like, they go underwater, no problem, all of those things. So those are the 3 cameras I use, and I always record multiple cameras. If you're doing video, always do more than one camera, because if your camera doesn't work or it stops recording, you are screwed. And that clearly has happened to me multiple times. So keep that in mind. I do also have a lighting kit, 2 lights that kind of, you know, just make it more clear, I guess. And you could get those for fairly cheap too. I think my light kit was only $150 by Newer, and I got it through Amazon. It comes with tripods, you know. And once again, something I could use for the YouTube channel. So it kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone. Now, do you need all these things? No. Another thing I added was smart lights. So I got those Hues, which are awesome. I love them. They're not just awesome for like everyday use, but I could use them to sort of make the environment in the room, in the office space, in any vibe. I could change the color of any of these lights, the top lights, the lights on the hall that you see there, and the one that's pointing down here, the one that's like that violet kind of color. all of those lights change, and they change to any spectrum of the color wheel. So things like that, just to be able to manipulate or, cause highlights and stuff like that, are good options, but they're not a must, right? So at the end of the day, if you're starting a podcast and you want to keep it simple, go with audio. Start with that. Maybe when you get like 20 episodes in, you bring in the video, you're starting to get a following. And that way you could also pump out episodes a lot quicker. And I'm going to describe to you where bringing in audio actually hindered me, but also benefited me. So we should discuss that next. But real quick, there's also software involved. So I use a software called Action by a company called Merlis. And I think Action software is probably about $20. It's pretty cheap. And it's great for YouTubers, streamers, Twitch people, all of that stuff. And what it allows you to do is everything from screen captures and screen recording to blue screens, gaming, going live, audio recording, you name it. It's essentially perfect for all of those features. And for $20, you can't go wrong. It's one-time payment, and that's it. And then on top of that, I use Zoom now. Because of the pandemic, we had to do most of the episodes through Zoom. So I had to kind of convert things, and as a result, I also have a Zoom subscription that's also $20 a month. That's actually the highest cost of my monthly payout for the podcast. Now, luckily, because I have sponsors on YouTube, I make that money back quite easily. The money I make from the sponsors kind of covers the cost for at least the Zoom, right? It's just $20. So it's no big deal. So once you start getting sponsors, that's where, things start to pay itself off, and you could start saving up money for better gear, which is what I do and what I did, right? I have goals to get better cameras. I have goals to get a new arm for the mic. And all of this comes from the profits of the sponsors. It doesn't come through anything else. So now that we've kind of discussed the tech aspect and the things that I use, I just want to clarify that there is no right or wrong way to do this. You know what I mean? You could do it with as simple as just your iPhone, and you could get just as crazy as a huge production in a studio. I do it from my own office space, from my home, and that's how that's how I roll. So I just use what I have on hand. I used to use an iPad as one of my cameras. I used to use like an old Canon camera that really sucked. But, I made do with what I had. And I feel like a lot of people, when you start the podcast, that's what you should do. You don't need to go pro right away. But you should have a level of quality that continues to go up. If you watch the older episodes of the podcast, you'll notice that every episode I kind of changed it up. I changed the format, changed the layout, changed the seating, adjusted where the cameras were going to be positioned. As the pandemic hit and we had to do Zoom episodes, I had to change the graphics and the borders and the outlines. And that's actually where Action comes in. All those graphics I have that are bordered and stuff, Action will do that for you. So it pre-records and you don't have to do it in post-production. But I did video first, as I mentioned. And when I started doing audio, something funny happened. 'Cause on my podcast on YouTube, normally I would get as I said, anywhere between 100, 400 hits. Usually I would hit 300 or 400, on average. But as soon as I started posting audio clips and audio for Spotify, Apple, and all that jazz, my YouTube views dipped to about half that, and my audio views took up that other half. So the thing that I wasn't prepared for was the amount of views I would lose on YouTube versus the amount of views I would gain from the audio platforms. In other words, half of my viewers now just listen to the podcast and don't watch the video, whereas the other half just sticks to watching the video. And thinking back on that, like if you're listening to this, I wish you would watch or use the YouTube platform. And this is a good segue to actually promote. Head over to YouTube and subscribe to the No Fun City podcast YouTube channel, because it's fairly new. And, you know, I think I only have like 20 subs on there right now, which is another factor, right? I took the podcast off of my personal YouTube channel and I moved it to its own YouTube channel, which caused me to lose even more viewers. But I did that with good reason. And here's why. Here's why I actually recommend you start a new channel for its own. So if you have your own personal YouTube channel and you're doing great, don't post your podcast on there unless you have hundreds of thousands of subscribers, because you're going to start losing subscribers. Here's what happened to me. Every time I would post a podcast episode on my personal YouTube channel, I would gain 2 or 3 new subs, like subscribers, but I would also lose 1 or 2 subscribers. And I quickly realized that the people that come to my YouTube channel, some of them just want to see the tech reviews. Some of them just want to see the electric longboarding reviews and videos. And some of them just want to see the podcast. So when I would post a podcast, I would lose a couple of followers because they don't want to see that. They want to see the electric longboarding videos. And when I would post the electric longboarding videos, I would lose 1 or 2 subscribers, but gain like 3 or 4. And the ones that I would lose came there for the podcast. So I quickly realized, I'm like, okay, I got to revamp this. And once again, this was all on the fly. I did not plan to even do a podcast. So hence why my journey to start was a little bit messy as far as the organization. And not to say that I'm the most organized person to begin with, but that's essentially why it was a bit of a more rocky road for me. And also part of the reason why I'm having this conversation with you now is so you don't make these same mistakes that I made. But going back a little bit to the tech side and to you, if you are thinking about starting a podcast, I think the more important question before you get into it is, should you even have one? That's the first question you should ask yourself. Because podcasting sounds fun, and it's a super saturated market now, especially after the pandemic. I saw like everyone had a podcast. Like my 3-year-old niece had a podcast. You know what I mean? Everyone's podcasting now. So understand that it's work. It's not just, hey, let's have a good time, let's talk and whatever, right? Like there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. So especially if you're a few people, if you're 2 or 3 people, you're going to have a much easier time with the workload than I do. Or if you have a production company behind you, holy crap, I wish I had that. I really do. It would take so much of the work off my end, and I would be able to do, you know, episodes bi-weekly or weekly at that point. But right now, there's just so much going on with me personally and other parts of my career that doing the podcast is still just something I do for fun. And, you know, that's just how I view it. And although I would like for it to become more professional and, you know, end up being a little bit, yeah, I guess I could say like more pro and more established and well known, that takes time. You're not going to do it in 5 episodes. So if you start a podcast and you don't have a following or followers after 6 episodes, like, well, no kidding, because you've only done 5 episodes. So don't give up. And that's why I say, should you have a podcast? Because it's all great and dandy until you start doing it. And then you expect to have like 1,000 views on your first podcast. And maybe you do. Great. But like, what if you don't? Does that mean you're going to stop 3 episodes in, 5 episodes in? Oh, it's not fun anymore because people aren't watching. Well, people aren't watching because you've only done 5 episodes. Do more. Then the other side of it is, do you have guests or is it just you? Like, is it sort of like you and a co-host and you guys just shoot the shit? And what's your niche? So mine was just going to be a general podcast, guest format, entertaining, and part comedic, and also part informative. And while I went down that road, it kind of became a Vancouver thing, and I'm cool with that. I didn't do that. The viewers and the guests did that, right? So It wasn't me saying, hey, this is the Vancouver's podcast. Like, this is Vancouver's podcast. No, I didn't say any of that. It just kind of happened. And obviously the name No Fun City relayed that to people, and it kind of connected people that way. But that being said, it's interesting because when it came to the branding, that's one thing that really stuck with people. Every guest that comes in here is like, I really like your branding. I love the name of the podcast. I really like your branding, all this jazz. And I did that stuff myself, right? So, you know, I have a degree in graphic design. Shout out Kwantlen Polytechnic University, GDMA program. So I ended up doing the branding myself, and the branding, the design of the crow / raven, whatever you want to call it, is an homage to a friend and also, I guess, colleague of mine, Richard Hatter from Hired Guns Creative. If you don't know who he is, you can go check him out. He does these amazing art illustrations, and he's won a ton of awards. Mainly deals with like beer bottles and beer designs. In fact, that's why I have beer bottles on my shelf behind me. A lot of people ask me that. It's not because I'm an alcoholic. I actually don't really drink that much. And I don't like most of those beers, sadly. But he has designed every label that's behind me. And they're just these beautiful, very detailed, like art pieces in my mind, at least, and very well thought out. And so when I did the branding, it was kind of an homage to the work that he does. Although mine is more simplistic and his is a lot more detailed. A lot of people it resonates with them. Why did I pick the crow? Well, if you're from Vancouver, you know that we have a lot of crows here, but also it's supposed to be symbolic. You know, like everyone in the city is a bit of a crow. And if you look at the eye of the crow from the brand, you will notice that there's a cityscape. Like the crow is seeing the city through its lens, and it sort of pieces together the fact of like our city is fun. The people in our city and community are also fun, and I'm gonna show that. But the funny thing about that is I got a comment from a friend saying, I don't like the name of your podcast, and I said, why? And they told me that it was because I am suggesting that Vancouver is not a fun place, which is not what I'm doing at all. I may call it No Fun City, but isn't that true? Like, if you really think about Vancouver, everything is always, oh, you can't do that. You know, oh, you can't. For example, we just legalized drinking in public parks, and only to a limited degree. But it's those small things that Vancouver does that gave it its name of No Fun City. You know, everything, you can't just do something here. You gotta the city's gotta approve it. The people have to approve of it. Everyone's gotta approve. Everyone's gotta jump on board. Oh, you know, like you better have like all your bases covered. And then at that point, after even the city has done like a bunch of testing and research, then they might be like, okay, you guys can have fun too. So when I call it No Fun City Podcast, A, it was because I own nofuncity.ca as the domain, but B, it's because it's kind of true. I'm gonna show you the fun in our city and the people who do awesome things. That was the goal, and not just in our city. You know, I've had guests from, like, for example, Montreal. Our next guest is also from Montreal, or lives there. She's originally from Vancouver. Sarah Kennedy, shout out to her. So there's so many facets when it comes to even the name of the podcast. Like, imagine that. Like, the name of my podcast was a problem for somebody. That's one viewer I don't have anymore, just because of that factor. So you really got to be smart about even naming your podcast, what the name is going to be, and even the branding. Like, you don't want to offend anybody, but at some point you're going to offend someone. It's just going to happen, I suppose. So beyond the tech and a bit of advice there, we're going to go down the road of my advice. So beyond what I've already said as far as advice goes, there's a little bit more to it. I suggest if you're going to start a podcast, you start it with at least one other person. Both of you don't have to be on camera or recording, but one of you should definitely focus more on the production side. The other one should primarily focus on the hosting and telling the story and questions or what have you. And, if you're 3 people, even better. But once you have like a host and a co-host, you really gotta be patient with the time that you spend talking. When I first started the podcast, if you watch the earlier episodes, you'll notice like I talk a lot more than my guests. But as the podcast goes on, I talk less and less and less, and I'm asking more questions, things like that, and kind of sitting back a bit. I'll talk about my own experiences from time to time, and maybe in length, but most of the time I'm more interested in what the guest has to say, and that's even more important. If you have a guest, at least if you're doing guest format, take the spotlight off yourself and make sure you put it on the guest. And the way that I realized how to do that was by watching and listening to my own podcast. As shallow as that kind of sounds, I feel like it's something you just have to do. It's the only way you're gonna really hear or understand the problems when it comes to your audio, your video, your speech, the way you're presenting things. I cured a bunch of errors or mistakes that I was making, even in hosting the podcast, by watching and observing the podcast. And you don't have to watch every episode, but you should continue to watch your own, or at least listen to your own episodes, because you're going to catch a bunch of things. Number 1, I caught my dog snoring many times and licking himself. Those are things that you as a listener have to listen to, and I don't want you to hear that. I realized that if I left the heat, like, my heating system on, and it triggered while I was on the mic, you guys would hear this buffer noise, like in the background, soft, but it's irritating, and it would come and go and come and go. So I learned quickly how to avoid certain instances and certain situations to make the podcast more clear, more quality, better every time I push. Another thing I noticed is I say and so much. Even in this podcast, I realized I said it a lot already. See? Right there. I caught myself, but it was too late. But yeah, I say those 2 things a lot, and I'm trying to cut back on that. It's not easy, but once you observe it, once you know what you're doing incorrectly, you can totally fix the problem or work on fixing the problem, which is most important. Always elevate the bar. Always elevate the bar. Always take the production to another level. You got 2 cameras, add a 3rd camera. You got 3 cameras, add better sound. You got better sound, use better software, post your podcast to different outlets. But if you're doing this solo, just understand it's going to be hard, especially if you're doing video. I suggest, once again, staying away from video right off the bat, especially if you're solo. If you're, a duo or trio, then by all means, start with both. If you can start with both, then great. If you can do it, do it. But understand, if you're 6 episodes in and you've got 50 views and that's not enough for you and you feel discouraged, then, you got to keep going. You can't really stop. One thing that keeps me going is the fact that I already had sponsors. I got sponsors for my last YouTube channel, which was a lot of work, right? Like, I think 2017 to now, I did a lot of work and provide a lot of content to get those sponsors, and now I'm able to move that forward into the podcast. But I'm really smart about the way I go about it. The primary sponsor for the podcast is Questrade, and that's by strategy. The primary primary sponsor on my YouTube channel is Loaded Boards, the longboard company, and like a few others. So why is that? Well, not everybody who watches the podcast cares about longboarding or longboards. And although I probably do post my link, like my affiliate link, in the description of these videos for Loaded Boards, they are not the primary sponsor of the podcast. However, everybody who listens to the podcast probably cares about finance, a little bit at least, or wants to trade, like stocks or whatever, or do better banking. So Questrade is perfect for the podcast because it makes sense. Everybody banks. Everybody has a bank account, Most of my listeners are between the ages of I think it was 26 and 32. And a majority of you are male. So I know this through all the stats that I have. And majority of you probably have a bank account. So why not, right? And Questrade, get this, I make a pretty penny off your subscriptions to Questrade. Or if you go sign up and add some funds into your account, at that point, I get a bit of a buck, which I'm thankful for. But I'm not going to bring a sponsor on the podcast that is going to make me, for example, $1 for every sale. Let's just say it's not feasible. It's just not worth my time. I rather have a sponsor that provides me with a bigger benefit, even if a few of you are to sign up. It makes more sense. I get more bang, quote unquote, for my buck. But another thing to note is that I don't do this for the monetary gain. Although it's great, and if I get more monetary gain and money comes in flowing, I'm not going to be upset about it, but that's not why I do this. So if you're looking for money through a podcast, 90% you're not going to get it, or you're not going to be able to make a living off of it. Most people that are able to make a living off their podcast have already established themselves in another way. So they had a YouTube channel, and they got a bunch, they created loads of contents for a few years, and then they made a podcast, and their following followed them there, and they already had all these sponsors. So it's sort of just a bridge, right? You're adding another island to your continent, I guess you could say. And that's essentially what I did, right? I did years of YouTube videos every once in a while and got sponsors, and then, okay, let's start a podcast, and domino effect, right? But even me, I don't have 1 million subscribers or anything like that. So I still do it, and it's just out of love. So if you're going to do a podcast and you're unsure if you want to do it, understand that you shouldn't do it for monetary reasons. You should do it for love. If you're famous, if you've got a huge YouTube following, or you're a YouTuber or an influencer, like a legit influencer, not a faux influencer, then by all means, you'll probably make good money doing a podcast. Just find your niche. If you can find a niche that works for you, for example, it's a tech podcast, or it's a podcast that goes based off Canadian history or health, whatever. Find your niche and do that. I don't know if you guys can hear my dog snoring in the background, but he's definitely up to it. So I apologize, but I try to do my best to keep his snores sort of, at bay, but I can't always prevent it. And that's another thing, right? These are things that I'm looking to kind of cure, right? I'm looking to fix these problems. Right now, my dog is a huge issue. He likes to lay down right next to me when he sleeps for some reason. So I can't exactly, if I move him, he'll just try to come back, or he'll get mad, or I don't know what. You know how dogs are. So I love him to death too. So I'm not about to get him out of the way. I like when he sits next to me anyway, so I apologize, but it is what it is. Okay, so we covered tech. We covered a little bit of advice. Oh yeah, we talked about sponsorships a little bit, but let's dive into this a bit more. So how do you get sponsors? Here's what I did. First of all, I lucked out. My sponsors came to me. I didn't reach out to anybody except for companies that had messaged me. But an important thing I will say is that you should always sort of collaborate or network with companies that you actually appreciate and believe in. If you want more information on how to get sponsors, I do have a video on my personal YouTube channel, which is under my name. You could look it up. And it's called like how to get sponsors with less than 500 subscribers. And to be clear, I got my first big sponsor with less than 250 subscribers on my YouTube channel. And I didn't even have a podcast at that time. I literally was just making longboarding videos. And I ended up getting sponsored by one of actually the top longboarding company in the world. Essentially the Nike of longboarding is what I would say. And that is what led me to get more sponsors. Because once you get one big sponsor, then you could go to other companies and be like, look, these guys are sponsoring me. This is what I'm about. This is what I want to do. Do you want to work together? And you are more likely to get other sponsors. After I got them, I ended up getting a bunch more. But one thing I will say is, and I really got to stress this, is if you really want to monetize and you want to monetize off your sponsorships, make sure you get sponsors that sell products that aren't like $10. And the reason for that is that the sponsors are going to give you a kickback for every sale that is made from your videos or from your channel or from your link clicks and affiliate links and all that jazz. If you're working with a company that sells $10 products, well, for every sale you get, it's going to be like $1 in your pocket. Whereas if you work with a company that their products cost like $100, $300, even $50, you know, the kickback for that, if somebody clicks an affiliate link of mine to Loaded Boards and buys a fully decked out longboard, it's probably going to cost them like $350 US. Well, I end up getting, realistically, like no bullshit aside, I get 10% of that. So if you spend $350 at Loaded Boards and you use my link, I'll get $35 US from that. And I think over the course of the past year through Loaded Boards, I'm only mentioning this detail specifically not to be like, whoa, look at me, because it's not, in my opinion, that much, but it's not that little. In the past year, I think through Loaded Boards, I've earned them about $20,000 US. So that's about $2,000 in my pocket. More than that, probably, but I'm just roughing it. And I'm telling you guys that so you understand, you know, like how your sponsorships should work and how much to expect to make. 10% is the average, I find. Most companies are willing to provide is 10% of a sale, whether that sale be $100 or $50 or $10. You know, I've had people, for example, spend $20 at Loaded Boards buying like something small, like an accessory that they needed, like, you know, a specific thing that was super cheap. And I get like $2. But, you know, every dollar counts, I guess. But it's better if you go after these companies that have products that do cost more, that are more expensive, that are in the $50 to $100 to $300, $500 range. And I think that's why tech review YouTubers tend to do well, because all these tech products cost usually $100, $200. And if you do a review video of like, I don't know, a Sony product or a Sony camera, and you're sponsored by Sony, and somebody buys a Sony camera using your link, well, you know, you've got probably a solid $100 right there. And you multiply that by a bunch of people who do that, and suddenly you've got a handful of cash, right? So I would approach sponsors in that fashion. And then second to that, when it comes to sponsors, is you don't have to wait for companies to come to you. There are many companies now, especially now online, on their websites that have literally like where all their home button, about us, contact, all that is, there's usually affiliates. And if you click that, there'll be a page that you could fill out like a form. And you could request to be an affiliate of a company. But just pick the right companies. Don't pick dollar store companies. pick like companies that are established and sell, high-end products, I guess you could say, or high-value products is probably the best way to put it. If you have any more questions about sponsors, you could fly me an email, but I think I've covered that part. Let's move on to guests, because I get a lot of questions about guests. So here's what I did. At first, when I started my podcast, obviously when you're at episode 0 and you haven't even done one yet, it's going to be really difficult to get a guest, especially someone who's maybe a notable guest, right? Or somebody who's like at a certain level where people would recognize them. For me, I knew that it was going to be difficult for me to get those kinds of guests. And obviously, unless you know somebody, for example, who's famous, who might be your friend, if that is the case, you're not going to get those sponsors, or not sponsors. You're not going to get those kinds of guests right away. You kind of have to prove yourself. So what I did was I just went through my friends and networks list, and I wrote down names of people that I knew were doing cool things. And it didn't have to be something extravagant. They don't have to be Elon Musk, you know what I mean? They could be an everyday Joe Blow that's not known, but doing something awesome. And those are the people that I requested to have on my podcast. And I would say 9 out of every 10 males would say yes to doing my podcast. And the female side was a little more difficult. Not so much now. Suddenly, females want to be on my podcast. It's really weird. But the female side, it was difficult getting females to be guests on the podcast for some reason. And I asked one female, like, why is it so hard for me to get female guests? Like why don't you want to be on the podcast? I just need to know, because I've asked, 10 females and only 4 were like, yeah. And this particular person told me that they just didn't feel comfortable being on camera. So sometimes it's not even about like not wanting to be on your podcast. Sometimes people just don't want to be in that setting. Like it's not your podcast. It's just they probably wouldn't do any podcast. I asked somebody, I'll give you a scenario, and I'm not calling anybody out, but I asked a female to be on my podcast. They said, sure, yeah, for sure. Let's talk about it, whatever, right? So I hit them up again to kind of schedule, and they didn't get back to me. About 6 months later, I kind of forgot about it. I had other guests coming and going. About 6 months later, I'm like, oh, I forgot about this person. They didn't get back to me. Let me hit them up again. So I hit them up again, and I'm like, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? Like, I got an opening coming up. And they're like, yeah, for sure. I'm like, I was on vacation, so I'm like, okay, I'll hit you up when I get back. So I message her when I get back from vacation. Ghosts me again. I'm like, man, like, if you don't want to be on the podcast, just say, sorry, I'm not interested. And I appreciate that much more than being ghosted. And you guys might get ghosted too, I don't know, but just don't let that hinder you. But I will say this, it's funny because the person who ghosted me actually started a podcast this past year, I think. And they're one of those people who did 5 episodes, then didn't do any more. So it's kind of sad. I wish that they had continued, because they are an interesting person, but, podcasting isn't for everybody, I guess. So there are instances where you're going to ask people, and this is the point of the story. It's not to, shit on anyone's parade, but you're going to ask people to be on the podcast, and you got to be okay with them saying no. And you got to tell them that too, because otherwise they don't want to be rude. They want to be nice to you. Yeah, sure, for sure, I'll get back to you, or something like that. So just be okay with people saying no, and it's all good. I will say this. I might ask you to be on the podcast once. I might, on top of that, ask you to be on the podcast twice. But I will never ask you a third time. And after the second time, you're done. The reason for this is I asked somebody to be on my podcast on one of the first few episodes. They said no and that they weren't interested. So I said, okay, no problem. But about episode 18, I guess they realized like, oh, his production is actually pretty good, and he's getting like guests that are actually like pretty decent. And they're like, hey, yeah, I'm really down to do your podcast now. I'm like, sorry, like, I've moved on. Like, I already have a bunch of guests on wait lists, people who, and I'll discuss this in a sec, people who have come to me to want to be on the podcast. But on top of that, I realized they want to be on the podcast now because now I have a bit of a following. Now I've got good guests and content. Now I've got things kind of rolling. So it benefits them more. Sorry, I can't just, like tit for tat here. I offered to have you on. You said you weren't interested. But now that the podcast is rolling a bit more, having a bit more success, has a little bit of a following and production value, well, no, because the benefit is only on your end. So I apologize, but I'm not down for that kind of trade-off, right? It's tit for tat. I asked you, you said no. Now you're coming back. It's not beneficial for me. So sorry. So I'll ask people once or twice, but after that, you're not going to be on the podcast again. It's just not going to happen after that. And especially at this point, because now something interesting has happened. After about episode 15, I started getting messages and emails from people being like, hey, I caught your podcast. This is what I do. I'd love to come talk about it. And that started making things so much easier. Because before I would have to hunt and think about different topics and who can I bring in and send them emails and correspond with them. And, it became a lot of administrative kind of organization stuff, schedule a time, all these things. Now, after every episode I post, 2 or 3 people reach out to me. Hey, here's who I am. I haven't met you. I'd love to be on your podcast and come talk about this topic. In fact, in January, I have a guest who did exactly that. Previous guests have done that. So you will get to a point where guests will start approaching you, and now you get to be the one to pick. Yeah, I'll have you on the podcast. No, sorry, I can't have you on the podcast. And I hate saying no, but there's a reason why I say no in some cases. There's a few times where I've had people wanting to be on the podcast, but I had already, I try to elevate the game, as I said, every time in quality. I'm getting to a point where I don't want to go backwards in my guest list, for example. And this is a weird thing to discuss because at the same time, I want the unknown person to have a voice, to come spend time talking on the mic. And, we do have those. But I also want known people and renowned people and notable people to start coming on the podcast. And the only way to do that is to elevate my guests, my level of guests, right? I have to bring more professional people in. I have to bring people who are educated in a topic or well known. I can't go backwards to people who are just starting something or just someone came up to me, and no offense to this person, but someone came up to me and they're like, yeah, I'm just finishing my first book. Well, is it done yet? No, but I want to come talk about it. I'm like, the story's great. I get it. It would be interesting to talk to somebody who is writing a book, but it's even more interesting to talk to somebody who's finished writing 1, 2, 3 books. So if I had to pick and choose, it's kind of like a resume. I'm going to pick the person who wrote multiple books as opposed to the person who only wrote 1 or hasn't even finished their first book. So every once in a while, there's somebody who wants to come on the podcast but doesn't really have any rep. And I think that is a huge thing you need to consider. It's okay for you to say no too. One other thing that I got to talk about when it comes to guests is, I had a professional adaptive boxer on my podcast, Leo Samarelli. So wheelchair boxer. The guy's story is insane, just crazy. If you haven't watched that episode, check it out. It's probably one of my favorite episodes that we did. And we did it on location. Thanks to my friends at Black Rhino Creative, Ryan and Danny, for hooking that and arranging all that for me. It was awesome. So right after that, I got a couple messages from other boxers and MMA fighters locally being like, hey, I'd love to be on your podcast, blah. But like my podcast isn't like an MMA podcast, right? I'm not going to have a boxer on right after having a boxer on. It just doesn't make sense. So for me, I always have to arrange my guests in order of how I feel like they should appear. If I do a male boxer one episode, well, the next episode better be a female, book writer. The episode after that better be, I don't know, somebody from a different ethnicity who's doing something completely different. And then maybe like 10 episodes later, I can bring back another boxer or fighter or sports athlete. So I always try to mix it up. I look at the guests that I had in the past and I kind of line up the guests for the future. If someone comes to me today and is a female musician, I'm not going to have them on the podcast for at least 6 or 7 episodes down the road, because our next guest is a female musician. Episode 19, we did a female musician. So, we've kind of covered bases there. If, however, this was a podcast about mixed martial arts, well, every episode would be a fighter or a coach or somebody involved in that, a promoter, those kinds of things. So really, when it comes to your guests, early on, look at your network, go to your network, get your first 5 or 10 guests from that. From there, send emails to people you want on your podcast and send links to the episodes you've done. They can see that you have established content, that you're continuing it, and they'll be more likely to want to be on your podcast. And if they don't want to be on your podcast, that's okay too. So speaking on the topic of guests, I also got another question of who was your favorite guest, who was your least favorite guest, and who is your dream guest to have on the podcast? All good questions. Favorite guest is kind of tough because there were a few that I had like really good conversations with. But I would say the most inspirational one is probably Leo Samarelli. Another inspirational one. These are based off of their stories, of course, and like their past life and where they are now. Chris Turcotte as well. That was a great conversation I had with him. If you knew what these two guys have been through and where they are now in life, it's really inspiring. And I admire those two guys a lot. So if I had to tell you to watch 1 or 2 episodes of the podcast, I'd probably recommend those two. Least favorite guest? It's not that I have a least favorite guest. Like these people are all cool. I've had least favorite conversations. I feel like the episode with David Daneman, I came in a little bit unprepared and he came in a little too sarcastic and trolling. But that's just who David is. And I love him for it, and he did do the podcast early on, episode 5. It was great to have somebody of his caliber doing cool things when it comes to illustration and comics to come on the podcast. It was a little bit rushed for me and a little bit, I don't know, just not really too serious. And I feel like there was a little bit of trolling there going on, but not necessarily my least favorite guest. I think he's an amazing person. It was just one of my least favorite conversations just because there was no real flow there. The conversation was really being pushed. He was also streaming it live, which I didn't really want him to do because it's kind of like I want people to watch the podcast, not watch it on his platform live. But I allowed it because I was 5 episodes in. Would I allow another guest to do it now? No, probably not. You could take this content after it's done and I'll hook you up with some clips and you could use those. So there are instances that has happened. Another guest, for example, another conversation I didn't really like was also an early on guest when we talked about, I think, so episode 1 you will not find anywhere, but it must have been episode 6 or something. It was, we talked about cryptocurrency and the guest was just throwing out so much conspiracy theory stuff that wasn't actually true, but he was saying that it was true. And I had to like go look up this stuff to make sure it was or wasn't true. And there was a bunch of stuff that was just far-fetched and a bunch of stuff that actually was correct. So it's just hard to keep track of what people think they know versus what they actually know. And I may have actually removed that episode. I'm not sure. I forget if I removed the episode, but it was just another episode I wasn't happy with. Those were the only 2 episodes I wasn't happy with. But the guests are nice people. Like, I'll hang out with David if he wants to ever hang out. I'll definitely have him back on the podcast if he wants to come on the podcast. But I would do the conversation a little bit differently, for sure. So no least favorite guests whatsoever. Every single one of my guests are my favorite. It's just least favorite and most favorite conversation at that point. But the more interesting question in that batch of questions is dream guests. Because do I have dream guests? Of course I have dream guests. I have a few of them. Especially this year, I want to, as I said, I want to elevate my game every time. One of the people that I want to have, one of the types of people I want to have on my podcast are people who are well known, especially in Vancouver, since this has kind of become a Vancouver themed podcast. And a couple of these people I actually do know personally. So I really would love to have, for example, Karm Sumal from Daily High Vancouver, right? Or Bob Crombar from Vancouver is Awesome, you know? Or is it Rebecca Balwit or Botwin? Oh, I'm going to screw up her last name. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. But Miss 604. These people who are a little bit into not just the social media scene in Vancouver, but just the media in general in Vancouver. So, you know, you could catch them on their own platforms, but you also know that they are part of something bigger. You know, Bob Crombar running Vancouver is Awesome. You know, it's a huge platform in Vancouver. You know, Karm Sumal running Daily High Vancouver, and just seeing the growth of that at his young age is just amazing. I would love to have him on the podcast. You know, Rebecca and how she started Miss 604, it's just beyond me. Those are people I would love to talk to that are local to Vancouver. There is one guest that would be like my ultimate guest. If I ever get this person on the podcast, I would be thrilled. I would be over the moon. And some of you probably are already guessing who this person's going to be, because it is a Vancouver local. And I would have to say Ryan Reynolds. That would be a huge podcast guest for me. Now, do I expect Ryan Reynolds to show up at my house tomorrow? No. Do I want him to eventually come on the podcast one day? Yes. Right place, right time. I hope it happens. You know, he's from Vancouver, Van City Reynolds. Didn't he just get the Governor General's award? You know, he does a lot of cool things beyond acting. You know, he's well known, world renowned, plays Deadpool, like just a lot of cool movies. Just Friends being my favorite Ryan Reynolds movie of all time. Like when he's sitting there singing, I swear. Do you guys remember that? It was a long time ago, but it was a good movie. I don't know. I haven't watched it in so long, so it might be a bad movie. But Ryan Reynolds, if you're listening, if you're out there, one day we got to have you on this podcast, especially because it's a Vancouver podcast and you're from this beautiful city. And you know what? On top of that, I would love to have his wife on the podcast too. Blake Lively, right? Yeah. So those would be my dream guests, 110%. But that doesn't mean that I don't want other guests. You know, there are a bunch of people who aren't well known or well established, but are doing cool things in Vancouver. And I want those people on my podcast too. So no real limitations to dream guests on the podcast, but it's just trying to elevate the guest or the level of guest, and I guess the notoriety, I guess their background, their quote unquote resume of things that they've achieved, Those are the things that matter to me now. And if slowly but surely I could work my way to the top of that pack, then great. And if not, that's cool too, because it gives room for other people to tell their tale. Now, if Ryan Reynolds hit me up tomorrow and wanted to be on the podcast, I would set up the camera so fast. Now that we've talked about guests, I'm going to let you know about a few of my favorite podcasts, because that was also another question. Beyond my own podcast, what podcasts would I suggest for people to listen to? And I consider myself a bit of an expert in this topic, because the reason why I love to podcast is the simple fact that I listen to podcasts so often, all day, every day, 5 days a week while I work from home. I work from home. I don't have coworkers. All my correspondence with my clients and people I'm working with are through emails primarily. And the only other living thing in my place is my four-legged friend who spends his time sleeping right next to me and snoring. So for me, podcasting or listening to podcasts is kind of like as if I'm hearing, coworkers talk or my social setting. I love conversational podcasts, comedic ones specifically. So we're going to get into some of my favorites, and I'm not going to recommend the Joe Rogan podcast, for example, beyond that, but I am going to recommend some podcasts that sort of network into the Joe Rogan podcast or are friends of Joe Rogan, for example. So if you're a hater of Joe Rogan for whatever reason, I'm not telling you to listen to his podcast at all. I'm just giving you a heads up that some of the podcasts I'm going to mention do somehow relay back to Joe. And most of these are comedic. I'm not going to give you an educational podcast or something. I like to laugh while I'm working. Everyone has their niche. These might not be for you. They're definitely for me. They're more so on the comedy side. So I hope you take that into consideration. If you don't like funny podcasts, then you should avoid these podcasts. Other than one, the very last one that I mentioned is my favorite podcast series of all time. So just make sure you make note of that one. So the first one I'm going to recommend is a podcast that partly influenced my own podcast. If you've watched the series or the episodes of my podcast where we do them in-house, you will notice that my cameras are set up in a 3-frame, segmented layout, where all 3 cameras are on screen recording in a specific layout. And I did that to an homage, or I did that in a sense by taking that idea from this specific podcast. And the funny thing is, when I first watched this podcast, this layout irritated me and I didn't like the podcast at all. But I warmed up to it over a few views, let's just say. And I actually got the same comments about my podcast by a few people, like, hey, I really like your podcast, but the 3-camera view layout you do is kind of distracting. And I told them the same thing that happened to me. I said, you know what? I hear you. Just listen or watch a few episodes and you'll get into it. On the other side of it, I've had people be like, oh, I really love the way you did the layout. That's so creative. And I feel so immersed in the podcast. Like I feel like I'm in the room. And that's exactly what I love about that layout too. So I took that layout format from a podcast called Tigerbelly. Probably one of my favorite podcasts. It's with comedian Bobby Lee and his girlfriend Kalila. And they usually do guest formats. So they usually have a comedian or an actor or actress from LA on their podcast. Everyone from, Tom Segura to Aquafina, like that kind of thing. But super comedic, super funny, and probably one of my favorite podcasts to watch or listen to. I didn't love it when I first watched it, but I grew to love Tigerbelly to a point where I actually own Tigerbelly merch. I have 2 Tigerbelly hoodies that I bought from their store. So it's obviously a podcast that I appreciate, and it's pretty funny. So you could check it out, Tigerbelly. They're on YouTube as well. They're also on all your podcast platforms of choice. So that's one I would recommend. Another one that I would recommend is, actually, you know what? Another one I would recommend is called Build and Buy Podcast. I believe that's what it is. It's by a friend and acquaintance of mine, local to Vancouver, Daryl Lim. Shout out to Daryl, who actually asked one of the questions about the software that I use on my podcast. And Daryl's done many episodes, and his podcast is pretty interesting. It's about it's more of an entrepreneurial one. So it's about people who buy a business and then, make it successful or turn it successful, or entrepreneurs doing cool things. So give the Build and Buy podcast a listen, because Daryl is local to Vancouver and he's a buddy of mine. And, it's pro. I really like the way that they do their podcast. So check his out for sure. A third podcast I would listen to is called If I Were You. And this is great, for example, if you're, on the bus or walking home, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of your time, you're going from point A to point B, you're on the go or you're walking, whatever. If I Were You is hilarious. So it's with 2 guys. I believe they actually were doing YouTube clips at first, YouTube videos, short comedy stuff. And then they started a podcast together. I forget one of the guys' name, but I think the other guy's name is Amir. I could totally be butchering this, but for some reason their name slipped my head. But If I Were You, essentially people send in questions like, hey, I have this problem, or hey, this situation happened to me. And they will respond by, well, if I were you, this is what I would do. And it's actually hilarious. A lot of the questions they could be raunchy, or they could be a situation between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, or, 2 partners, or a work issue, a guy having a problem with his boss. And these 2 will sit down for 20 minutes, talk about the situation, and they'll essentially tell you what they would do if they were you in the most comedic and entertaining way possible. So check out If I Were You if you like quick, short podcasts. That's a great one. But lastly, this is my favorite podcast series of all time. And if you know me, you have seen this on my Instagram stories. You've seen it on my Facebook. You've seen it probably on all my social media at some point. If you like those crime, detective, mystery, missing person type of podcast, so I guess we'll just call it true crime type of podcast, this podcast is definitely for you. It is called To Live and Die in LA. And it is by Neil Strauss. Neil used to be a writer for Rolling Stone magazine. I don't know if he is anymore, but at least he used to be. And this podcast is a limited series. For now, I just actually saw that they released a second season that I did not even know about. And I binge listened to that just like I binge listened to the first series. And this one threw me off my rocker. I could not stop listening to this. The only downside to this podcast is that in between each episode, there are adverts at the beginning, middle, and end. And the adverts are a minute long. But you could just skip through them. So that's what I do about the ads. But what Neil does is he's essentially a sleuth. And for those of you who don't know what a sleuth is he got into solving mysteries and crime and missing people type of situations. And he is really good at it. Now, I gotta explain this podcast a little bit to you at least, because in season 2, I found out something very, very interesting. You see, although season 2, in this limited series is the second part of a podcast. Oh, by the way, season 2 and season 1 are two completely different stories. They both revolve around two girls that go missing in LA. So two separate stories so far of two missing individuals in LA, two completely different stories that take you in two different directions. But there's a twist and turn, and this is all happening in real time. There's like interviews with people, they're talking to people, the conversation is recorded. They're dealing with like police and investigators and PIs and victims' families and all of this stuff to an extreme, to the point where they are literally, Neil is literally, may as well be a private investigator at that point. But it's really interesting. I found out something when I was listening to season 2. What happened in season 2 actually predated season 1. So they had recorded everything for season 2 before season 1 happened. And in season 1, you're introduced to a private investigator by the name of Jaden. I don't want to go too much into the story of what happens, but I do want to explain this because I think it's really interesting. So through season 1, you listen, Jaden's part of this investigation. He is, a private investigator. When you get into season 2, which predates, once again, season 1, it's important that you understand this. And for some reason, it's the second season. I don't know why that happened. But Jaden was the primary investigator for the story of season 2. And when he met Neil for the first time, he was very skeptical about working with these random people who aren't private investigators, they aren't police, they aren't whatever. And throughout season 2, when you get to the end of season 2, Jaden is talking to Neil, and he's like, hey, by the way, I have this other case of this missing girl. I think you need to help me out with it. Because he finally saw the value in what Neil and his friends were doing. And that, oh crap, these guys are actually really good at what they do. And they are. Like, they do some serious digging, and you find out a bunch of information. I don't even know how they find this stuff. Like, it's just, it blows my mind what Neil and his friends did. But at the end of season 2, Jaden is talking on the phone with Neil, and he's like, hey, I got another case about a missing girl I want to talk to you about. And it ends up being the girl who went missing in season 1. So it's like a full circle type of thing. And man, season 2 just ended, I think, this past June. The investigation for season 2 is still ongoing. But I highly recommend that one. And if you love crime, if you love mystery, if you love solving mysteries, To Live and Die in LA is for you. 110%. Go download it right now. Go on Spotify. You know what? Even stop listening to my podcast right now and go listen to that one. That's how much I love that podcast. I wish there was a season 3 because I wouldn't stop listening to it if there was. I can't wait for Neil to come out with another season, which is sad because in order for that to happen, another person needs to be missing. Which is like, I'm hoping that somebody goes missing. It's a very bad thing. But at the same time, that's how good he is. And I feel like part of it is because he's a bit of an investigative journalist, right? Like, he did work for Rolling Stone. He is a writer. But in my opinion, season 2 is much more interesting than season 1. The other reason for that is because I believe Mike, a bunch of his friends, a bunch of Neil's friends start helping him with this case. Like, they all, like 4 of them kind of come together and find out this girl is missing, and they decide to help out or what have you. One of those individuals is a man named Mike, who just happens to be part of the band Incubus. So imagine someone who's famous, musician, part of a famous band, Incubus. If you don't know Incubus, you could look them up. They're quite well known, I would say, maybe even now. And Mike, who's part of that band, is actually one of the people who is a sleuth in season 2. Now, I think Neil actually ends up handling season 1 all on his own. I don't remember any of his friends being part of it, or at least they weren't on tape or on camera or anything. But in season 2, you hear Mike talk. Mike's doing some investigating, and actually Mike's fame kind of helps with the investigation in some way. I'm not going to spoil anything for you other than to tell you what I've already said. And as you can see by the length of amount of time that I've spent talking about To Live and Die in LA, you should go listen to it. Go listen to it right now. That being said, I appreciate everybody for, number 1, their support for this podcast. Number 2, I appreciate everybody who sent me questions and emails throughout the past year and a half. To those of you who recently sent me emails, I'm sorry that it took me so long to respond, but I was waiting to make this episode so I could just send this link to you. And if you are listening and you have any questions or you're thinking about starting a podcast, feel free to hit me up. My contact information as far as my email goes should be in the description of this video, or it should be fairly easy for you to find the No Fun City podcast email. Hit me up there and I'll gladly respond, like no problem. If you think you'd be a good guest for my podcast, feel free to hit me up as well. Can't guarantee, but I'm always open. And yeah, that being said, next episode, which was going to be our last episode of 2021, is going to be with vocalist and soon-to-be music therapist Sarah Kennedy, who actually has a concert in Vancouver on December 28th. So you guys can check her out in the meantime. That episode will be posted shortly after this one, probably a week, maybe 2 weeks at most after this one. And then we're going to start back up in probably mid-January of 2022 will be episode 24. We'll see you on episode 23 in about a week's time. And then we're going to catch you in the new year. This is the end of the No Fun City podcast, episode 22. Peace out. Today's episode of the No Fun City podcast is brought to you by Questrade. There's a new world of investing where the fees are low and you come first. It's time to switch. Head over to questrade.com to check out do-it-yourself, self-directed investing. Take matters into your own hands, build your own investment portfolio with a self-directed account, and save on fees. Make your money work harder. Questrade is Canada's fastest growing online brokerage with over 21 years experience in the Canadian market, $18 billion in assets under administration, and a 9-time winner of the best managed companies in Canada. And you could rest assured knowing that your money is in good hands. They go above and beyond to protect your account with an additional $10 million in private insurance, so you know your money is safe. For more information, check out questrade.com. Just use the link in the description below.